most of them, but not all of them, involve breaking the law somehow. So if you look at the history of invention in the last 120 years, of the major things that we think of as important to our information environment today, whether it's television, whether it's the radio, broadcasting, whatever it is. This thing is making me a little nervous here. Good.
The one behind you will make you more nervous.
Fortunately, bigamy is not permitted in this country. But anyways, most of the important inventions in information involve two things. I've said it before. Number one, they're hacks. Number two, they often, not always, involve breaking the law somehow. And in fact, more generally, that's often how things change. The way things actually change in fundamental ways tends to be some combination of those two things, and I can talk about that later. But let's go through my examples. I have about 5 of them. I can start with the telephone, which is sort of the invention that starts many of the things we're still interested in today. And there's a couple interesting things around the invention of the telephone that I want to point out to you. One of them is the fact that Alexander Graham Bell himself was actually not a great electrician. He had a very poor understanding of some of the principles of electricity that were thought to be at the time. His actual profession, if you know anything about the history, is he was a teacher of the deaf. And so he had a very acute understanding of sound, but a very poor understanding of electricity. And it's the fact that in the stories and the history of invention, it's often people who don't really understand things too well who invent things in a strange way, because by not understanding current thought that deeply, sometimes you're able to make jumps forward that other people are cognitively limited in making. So I'm saying, if you're really at the cutting edge of your law, is a great example. Often law professors make some of their most interesting points right when they start writing. And it's because they don't actually understand their field that well yet. They're not deeply in the debate. They don't know what the finer points are. They just come to it and they see things. That's often true with invention too. So Alexander Graham Bell, he didn't understand electricity all that well, so he didn't realize what everyone had agreed, which is that you couldn't use electricity to carry sound. Everyone had agreed on that principle. It was settled. And because he didn't know that, he was able to do it. Number one. Number two, is one of the reasons, if you look at the history of the telephone, there's this there's this moment where Bell invents the telephone. There's a little bit of a pause. And then Western Union realizes this thing is actually worth money, the incumbent monopolist. And so they hire someone, namely Thomas Edison, to invent their own version of the telephone, which is way better, and he does it in a week or something. So it's not actually that hard at the time to do it. Technology is at the point where it can be done, if you give a talented person money and resources. But what the advantage that Bell had over everyone else is that everyone else was trying to improve the telegraph at the time. Everyone else was absolutely focused on the idea that the way to make money, the pot of gold, was going to be for whoever created the better telegraph. And their big idea at the time is they wanted to create a telegraph that go to the home. Which actually is a good idea, because that's basically email or text messaging or something. But they thought that is where it's going, and this voice stuff is just going nowhere. It's kind of a toy, it's for fun, it's not a serious invention. So that fact that everybody's trying to do something else is actually a huge advantage, and that's basically often what hackers are doing, is they're moving in a slightly different direction than everyone else, because they see something that other people don't. They're not watching what people are doing, they're watching what nature is telling them. And nature was telling Bell, you can actually carry voice on a wire. So that's number one. Technology number two I'm going to talk about is broadcasting. Broadcasting, radio, television broadcasting, ended up being, goes without saying, one of the most powerful forces of the 20th century. Launched armies, propaganda campaigns, NBC, CBS, obviously something, it really is the mass media. But who invented broadcasting? What's interesting is nobody really knows. or no one has there's people who claim to have invented broadcasting, but mostly based on fabricated documents. And when you go through the history and you think about the major inventions and you realize you don't know who invented it, it usually means there was somebody who got co-opted by somebody else. It usually means there was some kind of relatively minor hacker, usually a teenager or something, who came up with this thing and has been completely forgotten. The only time you remember when someone invented something is when they then have a company that bears their name. So everyone knows who invented the light bulb, because we have General Electric and Edison, which is Edison's company still. Everyone knows who invented the telephone because Bell is still around. The inventions that people don't know who invented usually are result from low-key, unknown hackers who came up with something. And that is exactly what happened with broadcast radio. Radio in the 19th century, brilliant invention, but it was firmly understood that the point of radio was point-to-point communications. Ship-to-ship communications in particular. And for that reason, terrestrial radio was severely limited based on the idea that it might interfere with ship-to-ship communications and create trouble. So there was very limited purpose you could put radio to. And so it took people who had no stake in the game, who were not really interested in things, to start using radio for a different purpose, which was namely for one person to reach many people. Broadcasting. Which, if you look in the dictionary from the 19th century, is still defined as a seeding technique. You throw seeds out, as opposed to narrowcasting, where I guess you put them in little spots. I don't know. And so it was people, and actually I don't think anyone has completely, conclusively figured out when the first radio broadcast was. It could have been as early as 1909. There was a radio station operating in New York in the 1910s, which claimed as many as 1,000 listeners. But the fact is that there were things happening in this area at least 20 or 30 years before CBS and NBC became part of it, and before radio became a mass technology. Let me talk about another similar one. No, actually a different one, chronologically. The next is the history of film. First of all, I want to point out that, like some of these others, very few people in this room probably know who invented the film projector and the movie camera. Important industry, huge industry, but who actually invented movies? Again, it's a story of basically someone getting shafted, which is a guy named Carl Jenkins. He did okay. He invented some other stuff. He invented the cone cups that hold water, and that's where he made it. You know those cone cups? That was his profitable invention. His invention of the movie projector didn't go well. And in fact, I think he said once, I can't remember how he put it, he said the inventor knows to himself that he has the glory, but he sees none of it in his own life, or something like that. He has a very sad kind of thing. Anyway, this guy invented, he and also French, there was also a simultaneous French invention of the movie theater. But we'll skip ahead a little bit and talk about the 1910s. 1910s, about 1909 or so, film was dominated by a trust that had a collection of patents over most of the important film technologies, known as the Edison Trust, and it was headed by Thomas Edison's film company. And this group had very clear ideas about what film was and what it would be as an industry. And their rules were like this. Basically, the ideal length for a film was 10 minutes long. 20 minutes long was allowed in exceptional circumstances. Plots were to be relatively simple, not involve anything that might be remotely controversial. For example, someone made a film that involved a burglary of a house, and the film trust decided in the future they should avoid that kind of thing because it would encourage criminal behavior. Actors and actresses were not allowed to be credited. And the idea was that if you credit actors or actresses, they would begin to ask for more money. And so to keep prices down, it was important that actors and actresses not be credited. So you had all these rules for film, no controversial films, obviously no political films, nothing going on. And there were a bunch of people who started to think, mostly exhibitors, that we can do better. We can make more interesting films. Their big idea basically was to copy European film, French film, mainly, because the French had invented this thing called the feature film, which is to say a film with a plot, the film we consider a film today, a feature film. Plot, characters, dialogue, famous actors, and so forth. They had this idea, and these guys were interesting guys. They were all from the Lower East Side, I think one or two from Boston, but almost all of them from the Lower East Side, almost all of them immigrants. And they said, we can do this differently. Basically, they didn't say it this way, but they thought, we can hack the film system. All right, we're going to make our own films ourselves, and we're going to make them good. We know what people want to see, even though we have all these rules. But the main problem with that idea was that everything they were doing was a violation of the patent law. Because they, in order to do this, had to break out from the trust and had to break every one of the trust's rules, and therefore had to operate without the licenses to all the patented technologies. And so they were sued. I think Carl Laemmle, founder of Universal, was sued 183 times in 1 year. Fox, the founder of 20th Century Fox, was hounded almost out of existence. He was accused by the film studios of running a prostitution ring. He was imprisoned. He wasn't in prison for long, but he was put into prison at one point. So these guys were chased around by the dominant media industry of the time, which was Edison Trust. And eventually it got so bad, and there are a lot of explanations why I did this. Eventually it went to the West Coast. A number of reasons for doing that. A little further away from New York patent suits and so forth. And that's where they went to Hollywood. Started this idea of Hollywood. So Hollywood was started by a bunch of hackers who hated the current media industry. Who thought the current media industry was oppressive, sensorial, and made bad movies. And so they made their own. Later on they became big and started their own cartel. But at the very beginning, it's important to understand that Hollywood began as a hacker enterprise. Next story is cable television. Cable is another one of those technologies which probably many people in this room use, but have no idea who invented it. Even though it has this, maybe you think Ted Turner invented it or something. He did invent some important stuff. I'll give him some credit. Again, it was like a very small-time operation. It was people who lived in the mountains or the hills of Pennsylvania who were unable to receive signals. And so most of the stories you read are about people who own electronic stops, something like that. They put up tall towers, grab signals, and they're able to send it around. It's an enormous industry again, and it leads back to the point about law. What happened within 10 years of cable television's invention is they were subject to debt-clearing copyright lawsuits, and began a 30-year legal campaign where the broadcast industry, which I said itself was begun by hackers, but nonetheless, broadcast industry tried to sue the cable industry out of existence. And I guess at some point in the cable industry, Comcast buying NBC can be seen as a sort of revenge for years and years of torment by the broadcast industry, who considered cable to be sort of low class. They weren't. Cable wasn't invented in a laboratory at MIT or somewhere fancy. It was basically rural. They wouldn't call themselves hacker, like electrician tinkerer types invented cable. And it goes on, and some of the more. I'll now conclude with the examples you're probably more familiar with, which are computer networking and computers. I think by now everyone knows that Steve Wozniak, who was sort of the motive force between the original Apple computer, that he and Steve Jobs had a project before the Apple I computer. Their original collaboration was a way of making phone calls for free on the AT&T network, known as a blue box. This was their first invention, and it worked. They figured out how to hack the network and make free phone calls. And I think that resistance to what was going on at the time, you see very deeply expressed in the early days of Apple. I mean, I kind of tried to keep that image going later, but this idea among the early computer people that they were reacting to the fact that computers were all in these enormous centralized institutions. The Defense Department, major universities, huge companies, that's where computers were. When you think about what Steve Wozniak did when he created a computer that could be sold for $1,000 or $2,000, it was a massive decentralization of computing power from the center to the people. And so there's a very intense ideology in some ways, a very powerful set of ideas embodied in the invention of personal computing. And I'll add to that the invention, or much of the invention of networking. Well, usually the story you'll read, and it's an important story, is about the founders of the internet and Vint Cerf and other people who I will give a lot of credit to. It is also a fact that I do not know if the internet would have reached anyone if you didn't have, in the 1980s and 1990s, the concurrent rise of basic computer networking, much of which was amateurs like myself as a teenager who were operating modems. And this is another one of these histories that is very little attention, but the spread of widespread amateur computer networking through modems, BBSs, and all this kind of stuff, usually with the purpose of trying to get software for free. Not always, sometimes to have discussions about issues of the day. So that's basically it. I think the case sort of speaks for itself. I don't want to say there hasn't been inventions that have happened in industrial laboratories or MIT and Stanford and places like that. There have been important things. Often they tend to be more of the nature of incremental, improving innovations. They do something and it gets better. IBM invented the mainframe, and a lot of computing, and then they would improve it, and improve it, and improve it. And that's an important role of innovation. I don't want to deny it. But there's also a lot of stuff that started with very humble, out-of-the-way, total outsiders, often who were forced to break the law. Now, we could say forced. They just kind of were oblivious to the law, usually. Sometimes they had to, like in the example of Hollywood. Now, why is it that we see so many of these important inventions come from these unlikely sources? Well, I think it's what I said earlier. It's very difficult to be aware or to think about what you're not thinking about. We're all of us in this room are highly limited in our cognitive horizons. When you think of a good startup, you probably think, well, Facebook was good, so maybe I'll add a couple features. Maybe hop some circles, put my friends in or something. You do this little step. You're like, okay, that's going to be much better or something like that. And sometimes these are important steps. But when you're kind of locked into trying to do what people are doing now, because you're so into it, you're so close to it, it's difficult to see the things that will send things in a very different direction. It's also very frustrating to try and go in a different direction. That's why back in the Bell days, the reason people were trying to invent the telegram as opposed to telephone is there was a market for it. And very few things cloud the mind as much as the prospect of enormous bundles of cash. If you think that this is where the money is, that is where people will direct their efforts. Of course, why would you do anything else? But the fact is that some of the most innovative stuff, some of the stuff that comes in a completely different direction, historically, has come from a very kind of different motive. And I will close by talking about that. I know many people have read works talking about this, but most of the hackers I write about, and I think those of you who are interested in this know this already, the motivation, the most powerful motivation is one that doesn't demand any external reward. In other words, it's called fun. That is the most powerful motivation, because if you do something and you think it's fun, then in some ways nothing can stop you. Because people say, well, you're not getting paid for that. Well, but I'm having fun. Well, you're not going to become famous, but I'm having fun. Who cares about being famous or having money if you're actually having fun? You are at a higher space than any of the rest of it. Right? So that is sort of the ultimate defense. And I think that is what is the most powerful form of motivation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.